As weird as it might seem, because people don't usually associate these two things, World War I was a major event in Native American Indian history. We have a picture here of three guys from the Fort Berthold Reservation in North Dakota, home of the three affiliated tribes of Mandan, Hidatsa, and Arikara. They are three out of about 12,000 American Indians who joined the military to serve during the Great War. Now, this despite the fact they were not citizens of the United States. American Indians still did not have citizenship. Of course, there had been a long tradition of Native Americans serving as allies of the U.S. military, going all the way back to 1776 and the Revolution, and even of American Indians serving in the U.S. military. In fact, on the Great Plains, the Black Seminole Scouts, who were originally from Florida by way of Oklahoma, who were employed by the U.S. Cavalry, were members of the U.S. Army, as were the Arikara Scouts that Custer used. With World War I, that tradition was not only continued, but in some ways intensified. In fact, beginning with World War I, in every subsequent war that the U.S. has been involved with in the 100 years since, if you look at it by race and ethnic group, Native American Indians have had the largest percentage of volunteers during times of war in the U.S. military. Now, not in actual numbers, but as a proportion of how many of them there are. And this has continued to be true. It's a way to express both patriotism and to express sort of the martial tradition. And we'll look at some specific examples of that later on. World War I, though, you did not only have young men volunteering to go fight, 12,000 of them, you had 10,000 women who joined the Red Cross to serve as nurses during the war. Also, war bonds, which were sort of an investment, a temporary loan to the government that was a way for the government to raise money during wartime. Over the course of the war, on the average, for every man, woman, and child among Native America, they invested about $75 a piece. Now, $75 100 years ago was a whole lot more than $75 now. And for the most part, these were people who had very little money. In fact, just one example of the way that people gave was that sometimes if they didn't have money, they would donate livestock or horses, which could be sold to raise money for the war bonds. When they did serve, they were not in segregated units, unlike African Americans who were in all black units. Native Americans were distributed across all the other units, so that you didn't have a company of 40 Arikara like Custer did, but rather you would have American Indians serving and fighting and sometimes dying side by side with other Americans, not African Americans, though, of course. World War II, there would also be the segregation of Japanese Americans. So, what this meant, among other things, was that just the general population of the United States, many of whom were involved in the war effort, but especially those who fought, odds are, if you were a white guy who was fighting in Europe in World War I, odds are there's at least one guy in your outfit who was a real life American Indian. So this reinforced the idea that Indians had not vanished and still existed, and gave a lot of white people an opportunity to meet, interact with, and be friends with Native Americans. And they learned that, hey, turns out they're people just like everybody else. And that's going to make a big impact. Now, unfortunately, if you compare the number of volunteers, like I said, there were a lot more coming from Native America. The number of soldiers killed in combat was 5 times higher for American Indians than for the military in general. And one reason for that is because of the romanticized positive stereotypes, which were still positive, or still stereotypes, um, in which, hey, here's a minefield. We got to pick our way through that. Well, this guy's an Indian. He's good at that sort of stuff. Or, hey, we need someone to scout out ahead of the lines. Send that guy. He's an Indian. He knows how to do that. Now, the fact is, they probably didn't know how to do that stuff because even if you were a Comanche or Lakota and you were fighting in World War I, odds are you're 19 or 20 years old. So even your parents, even your father probably had not served in actual combat. Maybe your grandfather, right? So a lot of those skills were lost, and as a result, they were put in more hazardous positions. Carlos Montezuma, by the way, who we talked about earlier, who was still very active, in fact, would be for another decade in Native American rights, he strongly discouraged Native Americans from volunteering to go serve, just as a lot of African American leaders discouraged young black men from serving because it seemed kind of hypocritical, right? For a group that is being suppressed to then be used, taken advantage of, really, to defend that country. But large numbers, as I said, of Native Americans disregarded that advice and did, in fact, go out and serve. One way, specifically, in which Native Americans used their unique abilities to serve was as code talkers. Now, you've probably heard about the Navajo code talkers of World War II, but that was not a new thing. It had been done in World War I, mostly with Choctaws from Oklahoma. That was the largest number. But members of many other tribes served in this capacity. Many other tribes from Oklahoma, the Oneida Iroquois tribe from New York, and several Plains tribes listed here: the Assiniboine, Cheyenne, Comanche, Cree from the very far northern plains in Canada, who served in the Canadian Army, Crow, Kiowa, Lakota, Ojibwe, Sauk and Fox, Yankton, Sioux, Dakota. And of course, what a code talker was is that they would, in communications, which was a new thing. Communications wasn't new, but communicating by radio was new. Communicating long distance in the way that in the 20th century people were able to start doing. And those things could be intercepted by the enemy, in this case by the Germans for the most part, who, if you're sending orders and telling the other, telling the other companies what to do or talking about the plan, then the Germans could just listen in. Odds are they had somebody that spoke English, even though those communications were often in code, right? So the Germans could break the code, and then they'd see what the message was in English. But how likely is it that the Germans would have a whole bunch of Choctaw Indians in the German army to interpret that? Not likely at all. In fact, the chances were pretty much zero. So they would have a Native American in the unit to send the message and then a Native American in the other unit to receive the message in code. And even if the Germans broke the code, they still wouldn't know what was going on because it would be in a Native American language. So it's unfortunate that those who served in this capacity in World War One are generally forgotten and not talked about in this context. The Lakotas had an official victory dance at the end of the war at the Standing Rock Reservation, held on November 30th, 1918. They waited about a week and a half after the war actually ended because there were still some concerns about public crowds with the Spanish flu going around. So they waited until they felt it was safe. Then they had this big celebration, and nobody complained about the traditional regalia being worn. It was a celebration of the end of the war, and they also raised money for the families of deceased veterans, of which they had some right there on the reservation. And here we have the Crow Chief Plenty Coup. The last time we checked in on him was 42 years earlier in 1876 when he was probably around 30 years old and had led that group of Crows to volunteer to serve under General Crook to go fight Lakota and Cheyenne. So here he is at Arlington National Cemetery for the dedication of the Tomb of the Unknown Soldier in 1921. As such a long standing American ally, Plenty Coup was asked to be the American Indian representative at this very solemn ceremony. And so he spoke a few words in his native language, blessing the tomb, and then he took off his headdress and placed it and his coup stick atop the tomb. And they are still at the museum at Arlington behind glass. You can see them there on the left. Standing with Plenty Coup on the right is Marshal Ferdinand Foch, the French military leader of World War One, who not only met with Plenty Coup here, but then later went to the Crow Reservation to visit him, where he was welcomed with honors. So, all these honors being given to American Indians, including being an official part of the ceremony for the Tomb of the Unknown Soldier, reflects how much appreciation the American public had begun to have for the American Indian contributions to the war effort, particularly when it came to putting their lives on the line. And like I said, a lot of U.S. soldiers got to meet and become friends with Native Americans. So there was a lot of public outcry about the fact that all these Native Americans being so honored and all these large numbers that had served were not American citizens. So in 1919, the U.S. Congress passed an act that gave American citizenship to all Native Americans who had served in the military during the war. So that's a huge step, but it also just highlighted the fact that Indians in general still were not considered American citizens. So, as a follow up to that, due to, again, more public outcry, in 1924, the Indian Citizenship Act made all Native American Indians citizens of the United States. Now let's take a look at what was going on with the Osage Nation in the 1920s. But to do that, we got to turn back the clock about 50 years. Now, in 1870, the Osage, after having been pressured for many years, finally agreed to give up their lands in Kansas and be removed to Indian Territory. Fortunately for them, they had held out long enough that now the president was Ulysses S. Grant, and he had that peace policy, remember, toward the Indians, and tried to treat them as well as he could, compared to other presidents. Although, again, once gold was discovered in Dakota Territory, that all changed. Anyway, before Grant, they had been offered 19 cents per acre for their Kansas lands. Grant offered them $1.25, so quite a bit more, right? It's like 6 times more. So when they did get to Indian Territory, and they were assigned a reservation in the northeastern corner of the territory, they had a little more money than otherwise they would have had. So they actually wound up buying their own reservation. So they took that money and bought the land that they were sent to, which put them in a good position when the Dawes Act was passed and allotment came. Now, they still were forced to participate in allotment and to divide everything up among all their members, except it's going to be a little bit different, right? Because with all the other tribes, the surplus land the government owned and could then open up for settlement or whatever they wanted to do. But in this case, since they had bought the land, they got allotted, everyone got their 160 acres, but they still owned, they legally owned the land left over. So they then divided all that surplus land among their own people, which at that time, there were a little more than 2,000 of them. And when it was all divided up, each family, instead of having 160 acres, had more like 600 or 700 acres. So their allotments were significantly larger. There wasn't a whole lot of resistance to this because, generally speaking, everyone thought their land was crap anyway. No one really wanted it because it wasn't very good farmland. They had made some money over the years by leasing part of their land to cattle ranchers to graze their herds. So anyway, when all was said and done, the state of Oklahoma was formed in 1907. The Osage had been allotted, but they owned their own land. And guess what? The next year, oil was discovered there, and unlike all the other tribes, they had retained, because of their ownership, mineral rights. So they got that oil money, and they had a headright system in which essentially all the oil money was shared equally with all the Osage members, so that by 1926, each family was getting about $65,000 a year, which is a whole lot of money 100 years ago, right? Well, as a result of this, a lot of people around the country had sort of a negative attitude toward the Osage and Indians in general. Somehow this got parlayed into all these Indians are living for free on this land, and the government's still paying a lot of them money that they promised to pay. And here they are, just filthy rich, rolling in money, just living it up, and wasting it and not having to work, and all the same things people say today about casinos, oddly enough, because, well, it's been a long American tradition, right? As long as Indians are noble and vanished or vanishing, that's fine. But once they start making money, a lot of people have problems with that. In reality, things were not nearly as rosy in Osage country, as indicated by this 2017 book, Killers of the Flower Moon, that is currently being made into a movie directed by Michael Scorsese. And the same incidents provide a plot point in a 1959 Jimmy Stewart movie called The FBI Story that even had a comic book adaptation. So here's what was going on. As I said, a lot of people got really ticked off at the thought of Indians with money. Something has to be done. And in fact, Congress took it up. And Congress decided, with their plenary power, remember, and their tradition of thinking that Indians are incapable of making decisions for themselves, they decided that since there's nothing that could be done about the fact they owned the land and had the money, perhaps something could be done about how that money was administered. And Congress mandated that each of these Osage families have guardians, white guardians, who would essentially run their business for them and handle their money for them. Now, this led to a lot of corruption in that these white guardians would often pay themselves or sell stuff to the family that they were guardians of at really jacked up prices, which they paid themselves out of the Osage money. And in some cases, it got worse than that. You see, because this was a headright system, not owned by individuals, but by the whole group, headrights to the oil couldn't be sold, but they could be inherited. So a lot of these white guardians, sometimes marrying into Osage families to become heirs that way, sometimes pressuring the families into naming them as heirs, then started killing them. There were, in the 1920s, more than 24 murders in that one little area of Osage people who were being shot and stabbed, and in one case, a couple was blown up in their home by a bomb. And then their share of the oil money went to their now their white heirs. This attracted attention after a little while, and the newly formed FBI sent undercover agents onto the reservation, and they were able to catch some of the people. To get enough evidence on some of the people behind these schemes. One of them was a local cattleman who had killed several members of the same family. And this is one of the first major cases of the newly formed FBI. So even when Indians have money, it can be problematic in the even into the 20th century and into the 21st as well. So that's what happened when Indians had money. What about when they did not have money, which would basically be everybody else? Well, despite the fact that the public had this now stereotypical view that all these Indians were rolling in money all around the country on these reservations, living it up, everyone didn't necessarily agree with that assessment, including a sociologist named John Collier, who started to get involved with Native American issues in the early 1920s, when he spent time on a Pueblo reservation in Taos, New Mexico, and saw all the poverty, the incredible poverty there. And when he came to the conclusion that the Dawes Act was a total disaster and needed to be reversed, that Native peoples needed to have more religious independence and more independence in general. And so he got involved, along with a guy named Harold Ickes that we'll talk about in a moment, in trying to improve things by encouraging the government to change its policies. So he testified before Congress that things were not as good as everyone was saying on these reservations. So Congress approved an investigation, an investigation that was to be led by Lewis Miriam of the Institute for Government Research, that would later be called the Brookings Institute. It was funded by the Rockefeller Foundation. So Miriam and his associates spent a couple of years, 1926 and 27, visiting these reservations, and they prepared a report that was released in 1928 and is known as the Meriam Report. And that report indicated that there was a lot of poverty, that 71% of Native Americans made less than $200 a year. And at that time, the average income of the average American was $1,200 a year. So, in other words, 1/6 of the average. Also, they discovered that disease was rampant, that medical care was spotty at best. Basically, they concluded that, in fact, yes, Collier was right. The Dawes Act was a disaster. And the whole point of the Dawes Act had been to improve things for Native Americans. And it seemed that specifically that law and that policy had made things significantly worse. The organization that had been led by Collier and Harold Ickes, the American Indian Defense Association, which had been criticizing government policy throughout the 1920s, with the release of the Meriam Report, seemed to have been vindicated. And here's what else happened. The public had developed a lot of admiration for American Indians as a result of their service in World War I. And when this report was released and people throughout America found out just how bad it really was on the reservations, public sympathy for them grew. And the Bureau of Indian Affairs lost a lot of credibility, and it lost a lot of support. Then the Great Depression started in 1929, and things got significantly worse.